The chamber was already tense when Bill Barr leaned into the microphone. The room, rows of lawmakers, the press hunched over laptops, cameras blinking red, felt like the eye of a political storm. Barr's tone cut through the air, heavy with contempt and calculation. "Congresswoman Crockett," he sneered, pausing just long enough for the silence to tighten around them. "Your accusations are baseless lies, and you know it." A wave of gasps rippled across the room. Some members shifted uncomfortably, others smirked, sensing the blow Barr thought he had just landed. The former Attorney General sat back in his chair, lips curling into a satisfied grin. In his mind, this was the knockout punch, the seasoned heavyweight humiliating a first-term Congresswoman on national television. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she calmly reached for the thick binder in front of her and opened it with deliberate slowness, the sound of paper sliding against paper echoing louder than Barr's insult. Her eyes never left his. "Let's see if America agrees," she said quietly, almost like a promise rather than a threat. "Once they see this." The room stilled. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer. Barr's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. A hairline crack in his confidence before he shifted in his seat and tried to reclaim the upper hand with a dismissive shake of his head. But everyone in that chamber could feel it. The balance of power had shifted. This wasn't the story Barr thought he was writing. It wasn't a public scolding or a routine takedown of a political opponent. It was something else, something far more dangerous for him, because Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to trade insults. She had come armed with something heavier, sharper, and far more devastating than words, the truth. And as she flipped to the first page, the weight of what she was about to reveal seemed to press down on the room itself. No one, not the reporters, not the lawmakers, not even Bill Barr, was prepared for what was coming next. No one in that chamber, least of all Barr himself, was ready for the storm she was about to unleash. To the casual viewer flipping channels, it might have looked like just another partisan clash in Washington, another heated exchange destined to vanish in tomorrow's news cycle. But this moment was different. What was unfolding in that hearing room wasn't merely a spat between a former Attorney General and a first-term Congresswoman. It was a collision course between two visions of America, and the outcome could ripple far beyond those marble walls. Because this wasn't just about Bill Barr and Jasmine Crockett. It was about truth itself. Billions of people depend on the American justice system, not just to prosecute crimes, but to uphold the very idea that no one is above the law. Yet what happens when the people sworn to protect that system, the ones entrusted with its highest powers, twist it for political gain? What happens when the guardians of justice lie? For decades, men like Barr have operated behind a shield of establishment authority. They've written the rules, shaped the narratives, and controlled the levers of power, often without facing real consequences. And in that insulated world, challenging them was unthinkable. Until now, enter Jasmine Crockett, a black progressive congresswoman from Texas, raised on stories of struggle and resilience, who came to Washington not to blend into the background, but to tear down the walls that kept people like her, and the communities she represents, on the outside looking in. To Barr and his allies, she's easy to dismiss, a radical, they sneer, more interested in headlines than the hard work of governing. They paint her as partisan and reckless, a product of a new political generation that confuses passion with substance. But to Crockett, the stakes couldn't be clearer. Corruption, she argues, isn't a Republican problem or a Democratic problem. It's an American problem, and left unchecked, it corrodes democracy from the inside out. She isn't just calling out Barr. She's calling out a system that has too often allowed men like him to act with impunity. And that's why this confrontation matters. Because it isn't just one woman questioning one man. It's a generational reckoning. Old power being dragged into the light by new voices who refuse to be silenced. It's establishment arrogance clashing head-on with rising accountability. It's the myth of untouchable authority meeting the unstoppable force of truth. The symbolism is impossible to ignore. On one side of the table sits Bill Barr, the embodiment of entrenched Washington power, confident, dismissive, certain that history bends toward the powerful. On the other side's Jasmine Crockett, young, relentless, representing a new wave of leaders who believe history bends only when someone is brave enough to pull. This wasn't just a hearing. It was a referendum on who gets to define reality in America, those who have long controlled the narrative or those determined to rewrite it. And the stakes stretch far beyond that room. Because if Crockett succeeds, she won't just expose Barr. She'll send a message to every powerful figure who's ever hidden behind a lie. Your era of untouchable authority is ending. But if she fails, if Barr's dismissal and deflection win the day, it won't just be her reputation on the line. It will be the principle that truth can still triumph over power. The cameras kept rolling. The country kept watching. And what had begun as a calculated smear attempt by a seasoned insider was about to transform into something far bigger, a political earthquake that would shake Washington to its core. And Crockett. She was just getting started. Before the cameras, before the gasps, before the words, "Your accusations are baseless lies," echoed through that hearing room, William Pelham Barr had already lived a lifetime as one of Washington's most enduring power brokers. To understand why this clash mattered, and why it threatened to end a legacy decades in the making, you have to understand the man behind the smirk. Barr's journey through the halls of American power began quietly. A legal insider with a sharp mind and an even sharper instinct for political survival, he rose quickly through the ranks of the Justice Department in the late 1980s. By 1991, he was appointed Attorney General under President George H.W. Bush, his first turn as the nation's top law enforcement officer. Even then, he was known less for independence and more for loyalty, earning a reputation as a man who could bend the machinery of justice to serve the needs of those in power. That reputation would only harden decades later. In 2019, Barr returned to the Justice Department, a rare second act in a role few ever hold twice, this time under Donald Trump. And if his first tenure had been defined by quiet efficiency, his second would be remembered for something else entirely. His transformation into what critics called the White House's fixer. From the moment he stepped back into the job, Barr seemed less interested in being the people's attorney and more in being the president's shield. The defining example came with the Mueller report, a nearly 2-year investigation into Russian interference and potential obstruction of justice. Before the public could read a single page, Barr seized control of the narrative. He released a carefully worded summary that downplayed damning findings and framed the report as an exoneration. By the time the full document emerged weeks later, much of the public had already absorbed Barr's version of the truth. It was a masterclass in narrative manipulation, one that infuriated legal experts and lawmakers alike. Critics accused Barr of misleading Congress, misrepresenting evidence, and weaponizing the Justice Department for partisan ends. He dismissed the outrage as partisan hysteria. "The job of the Attorney General," he insisted, "is not to play to the political process, but to uphold the rule of law." Yet over and over, his actions told a different story. From intervening in cases involving Trump allies to echoing the president's rhetoric about law and order during nationwide protests, Barr's Justice Department seemed less like an independent institution and more like an extension of executive power. Even when federal prosecutors resigned in protest over political interference, Barr remained unmoved. He knew the game. In Washington, outrage fades, headlines pass, and those who control the story often control the outcome. Barr's media strategy became as predictable as it was effective. When critics accused him of politicizing justice, he called them liars. When career prosecutors questioned his decisions, he accused them of bias. When oversight committees demanded accountability, he wrapped himself in the language of law and order, portraying himself as a lone defender of institutional integrity against a mob of partisan attackers. And for a long time it worked. The very hypocrisy that should have destroyed him became the source of his strength. He was, after all, the Attorney General, and with that title came enormous power. Even when controversies piled up, Barr weathered them with practiced ease. Confident that Washington's attention span was too short, and its memory too forgiving to ever truly hold him accountable. But beneath that veneer of control lay the contradiction at the heart of his legacy. A man sworn to uphold justice, repeatedly accused of distorting it. a self-styled guardian of the Constitution accused of shredding its most sacred principles for political convenience, a champion of law and order accused of bending the law to protect those in power. It was this hypocrisy, polished, rehearsed, and deployed like a weapon, that Barr carried with him into that hearing room. And it was the same playbook he reached for the moment Jasmine Crockett challenged him. Call her a liar, paint her as a partisan, reduce her evidence to political theater. It was a strategy that had neutralized senators, prosecutors, even entire investigations. And to Barr, there was no reason to believe it wouldn't work again. But there was one thing Barr hadn't accounted for. Jasmine Crockett was not another headline he could wave away. She wasn't a pundit or a prosecutor constrained by bureaucratic chains. She was a new kind of adversary, fearless, unyielding, and armed not just with outrage but with proof. And as she reached for that thick binder on the table before her, Barr's old tricks were about to collide with a force they had never faced before. One that could unravel the careful narrative he had spent a lifetime constructing. Because this time, the story wasn't his to control. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in that hearing room, before the cameras, the binders, and the showdown with one of Washington's most entrenched power players, she was just a girl from a working-class family in Texas who had been taught that silence was not survival. Speaking up was. She grew up watching her parents stretch every dollar and work every hour to keep the lights on and food on the table. Their message was simple but unwavering. The system may not have been built for people like them, but that was exactly why they had to challenge it. It was in those small but powerful lessons. Watching her mother refuse to back down from a landlord trying to hike the rent illegally. Watching her father insist on being treated with dignity on the job. That Jasmine first understood the quiet violence of injustice. It wasn't always a headline. Sometimes it was a shrug. Sometimes it was a door quietly closing on someone who deserved better. By the time she reached college, that understanding had hardened into purpose. She devoured books on civil rights law, marched in protests, and volunteered for local legal aid groups. Every eviction case she witnessed, every voter turned away from the polls, every young black man harassed by police became another reason to keep pushing. Law school was grueling, but she didn't just survive it. She turned it into her launch pad. She wasn't interested in corporate boardrooms or cushy clerkships. She wanted to be on the front lines, and that's exactly where she went. As a civil rights attorney, Crockett built a reputation not just for being relentless in court, but for being present in the communities she served. She filed lawsuits against police departments that violated constitutional rights. She represented families whose loved ones had been killed in custody. She challenged voter suppression laws designed to silence black and brown voices. And when city councils and party leaders told her to slow down or be more strategic, she didn't flinch, because she knew that delay was just another form of denial. One of her earliest cases still burns in her memory. A young mother wrongfully arrested during a traffic stop, whose life was torn apart by a system that treated her as disposable. Crockett fought tooth and nail, and when the city settled and agreed to policy reforms, she understood something profound. Real change wasn't just about one case or one courtroom. It was about rewriting the very rules that allowed injustice to thrive. That realization propelled her into politics, a leap that came with its own set of battles. Running for office meant knocking on doors where no one believed a young black woman could win. It meant debates where opponents smirked as they called her too radical or too inexperienced. It meant fighting for funding while insiders whispered that she was too loud for the halls of power. But every insult was oxygen. Every dismissal was fuel, and when she won her seat in Congress, she didn't tone it down. She turned it up. In Washington, Crockett quickly became a thorn in the side of the establishment, and not just the Republican one. She grilled witnesses who thought they could lie under oath without consequence. She introduced bills to strengthen voting rights in the face of a wave of state-level restrictions. She took on police unions and challenged the Department of Justice on civil rights enforcement. And she did it all without apologizing for who she was or where she came from. Some colleagues rolled their eyes. Others warned her to pick her battles. But Crockett knew the truth. Every battle mattered when people's lives and freedoms were on the line. and for those who had spent decades silencing women like her, calling them angry, calling them unqualified, calling them impossible, she had a simple message: watch me. Her defiance wasn't just about politics. It was about representation. She carried with her the weight of generations who had been told they didn't belong. In the courtroom, in the legislature, in the rooms where power decided their fate. And every time someone tried to shut her up, she spoke louder. Every attempt to sideline her only sharpened her resolve. By the time Bill Barr called her a liar in that packed hearing room, Jasmine Crockett was not just another member of Congress. She was the culmination of a long fight, one waged by activists, organizers, and everyday people who refused to accept a system rigged against them. She was the attorney who had looked corrupt police chiefs in the eye and said, "Not anymore." She was the lawmaker who had stared down party bosses and refused to trade her convictions for convenience. And now, she was the woman who would look a former Attorney General, a man once thought untouchable, in the eye and say, "Prove it." Because for Crockett, this wasn't about scoring political points. It wasn't even about winning a debate. It was about something far bigger, showing that truth still matters. That accountability is not partisan. That power, no matter how entrenched, can still be challenged when someone is brave enough to speak up. And as she prepared to speak, as that thick binder lay waiting on the table between her and Barr, one truth burned brighter than ever. Every attempt to silence her had only taught her to speak louder. And today, her voice was about to echo across the nation. Bill Barr leaned back in his chair, confidence radiating from every smug smirk as cameras zoomed in. He tapped his microphone once, twice, before delivering the kind of sneering dismissal he'd perfected over decades in Washington. "Your so-called evidence," he said, savoring the words, "is nothing more than a partisan stunt. You're embarrassing this committee, and quite frankly, yourself." The words landed like a grenade. A few of Barr's allies chuckled audibly, one even shaking his head in mock pity. Others leaned back with folded arms, basking in the spectacle. On cable news, the chirons changed within seconds. Barr blasts Crockett over baseless accusations, and former AG humiliates progressive firebrand. It was the tactic he'd used 100 times before. Discredit, diminish, dominate, paint the opponent as unserious before they even open their mouth. And for a moment, it seemed to be working. The laughter in the chamber grew louder, the pundits' voices more confident, the narrative solidifying in real time. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes or raise her voice. Instead, she quietly scribbled something on the notepad in front of her, her face unreadable. It was the kind of composure that made the room uneasy, the kind that said you think you're winning, but you have no idea what's coming. "Do you have anything to add, Congresswoman?" the chair asked, perhaps expecting a fiery rebuttal. Crockett didn't look up from her notes. "Not yet," she said softly. "I'm still letting Mr. Barr finish his performance." A few gasps broke through the chamber noise. Barr forced a chuckle, waving his hand dismissively. "Performance? Congresswoman, this isn't theater. This is oversight. Something you clearly don't understand." "On the contrary," Crockett replied, now meeting his gaze with unflinching calm. "I understand oversight perfectly. I also understand projection." Barr bristled. "Projection?" "Yes," she said, still measured. "Because for someone so confident about his innocence, you seem awfully desperate to make sure no one sees what's in this binder." The room shifted. The laughter faded. A few heads turned toward the thick folder sitting beside Crockett, the same one she'd hinted at when Barr first called her a liar. Suddenly, the energy in the hearing wasn't so one-sided. But Barr wasn't done. "You have nothing, Congresswoman. Just a stack of rumors from partisan blogs and activist groups. You're wasting this committee's time." "Wasting time?" Crockett asked, her voice still even, almost disarmingly so. "Tell that to the families whose civil rights cases were buried under your Department of Justice. Tell that to the whistleblowers who were silenced. Tell that to the voters whose complaints were ignored because it was inconvenient for your political allies." The room erupted into murmurs. Barr shifted in his seat, irritation flashing across his face. "This is exactly what I mean," he snapped. "Unfounded conspiracy theories dressed up as righteous crusades. And yet, Crockett replied, every time we get close to the truth, you call it a conspiracy. Every time someone challenges your narrative, you call them a liar. It's almost as if you're afraid of something. Barr leaned forward, jaw tightening. I'm afraid of nothing, Congresswoman. Certainly not you. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The silence stretched on. The kind of silence that says everything words cannot. Narrator. Every insult only made the silence around her more deafening. Every taunt was another thread in a trap Barr couldn't see tightening around him. On social media, the hearing had gone viral. Clips of Barr's dismissive jabs were already circulating with captions like "Classic Barr" and "Crockett outmatched." But so were quieter, more powerful images. Crockett sitting silently, binder untouched, eyes fixed on Barr like a surgeon waiting for the right moment to cut. Because that's what this was. Not a shouting match, not a spectacle. It was surgery, and Barr, despite all his bluster, had no idea how deep the incision was about to go. As the chair tried to move the hearing forward, Crockett finally closed her notepad and pushed the binder slightly closer to the microphone. Her voice was calm, but her words carried like a gavel striking oak. Mr. Barr, she said, you've spent a career controlling the story. But stories end and evidence endures. The room went still. Barr blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. And then, with one sentence, Jasmine Crockett flipped the entire hearing on its head. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly from her chair. The weight of the thick binder in her hands matched only by the weight of the silence that had fallen over the chamber. Every camera in the room pivoted toward her. Even Barr, who had spent most of the hearing lounging with smug ease, shifted slightly in his seat, a flicker of something almost imperceptible crossing his face. You call me a liar. Mr. Barr, she began, her voice steady and clear. But liars fear facts, and facts don't fear you. A low murmur rippled through the audience. Barr forced a tight smirk, but his fingers tapped impatiently on the table. Crockett opened the binder and carefully removed the first document. Let's start here, she said, holding it up so the cameras could see. An internal Department of Justice memo, dated March 12, 2020. It shows direct pressure from your office to downplay findings in an investigation involving a company whose CEO happened to be a major donor to the administration. You signed this, didn't you? Barr shifted, clearing his throat. I don't recall. You don't recall, Crockett interrupted, flipping to the next page. Because the whistleblower who provided this certainly does. And so does the Inspector General, whose notes indicate that political considerations, not evidence, dictated the outcome. A few scattered gasps cut through the silence. Cameras zoomed in on the memo as reporters furiously typed notes. Crockett turned another page. Here's another, she said. Financial records connecting the same donor to a private dinner you attended 2 weeks before the DOJ abruptly reversed course on that very case. I'm sure that's just a coincidence? That's irrelevant, Barr snapped. Completely irrelevant to the substance. Substance? Crockett's tone sharpened. The substance is that justice was bent to serve power. That's not just unethical, that's illegal. And you knew it. Barr opened his mouth to retort, but Crockett pressed on, her voice gaining strength with every sentence. Here, she said, pulling out another set of documents, is testimony from a DOJ attorney, sworn under oath, describing how your office instructed them to consider the political implications before pursuing charges against senior administration officials. Does that sound like impartial justice to you, Mr. Barr? It's hearsay, Barr barked, the veneer of composure beginning to crack. This entire line of questioning is a smear. Smears fade, Crockett said firmly, locking eyes with him. Evidence doesn't. The chamber erupted in hushed conversations. Even some of Barr's allies looked unsettled. This wasn't fiery rhetoric anymore. This was documentation, testimony, receipts. And they were piling up. Crockett placed the binder on the table with a quiet thud. You want to talk about law and order? Let's talk law and order. She held up a Supreme Court citation. In Berger v. United States, 1935, the court wrote that a prosecutor's interest in a criminal prosecution is not that it shall win a case, but that justice shall be done. And yet, under your leadership, The Department of Justice became a shield for the powerful and a weapon against the powerless. She flipped to another page. In United States v. Nixon, the court ruled that not even the president is above the law. Yet you advised executive privilege in cases where privilege clearly did not apply. Why? Because accountability is inconvenient? The audience was spellbound now. Phones streamed live. Headlines were already forming. And Barr, once untouchable, unflappable Barr, was visibly sweating. "This is absurd," he said, his voice tighter than before. "This is all politically motivated nonsense. You're twisting events, cherry-picking quotes." "Cherry-picking?" Crockett raised an eyebrow. "Then let's use your words." She flipped to a printed transcript of a televised interview. "The president has broad authority to direct investigations as he sees fit," she read aloud. "Your words, Mr. Barr. A statement you made while defending interference in ongoing investigations. But here's the problem. The DOJ's own ethics manual, which I have right here, says political influence in prosecutorial decisions is a violation of the department's integrity standards." She stepped closer to the microphone. "So which is it, Mr. Barr? Were you lying then, or are you lying now?" A stunned hush fell over the chamber. Barr's mouth opened, then closed. No words came. Crockett leaned in, voice lower but cutting deeper. "Truth isn't partisan, and power isn't justice, not when it hides from accountability." That line hung in the air like a verdict. The murmurs in the gallery swelled into audible gasps. Someone in the back clapped once, then twice, and soon a wave of applause swept the room. Even those who had mocked her earlier now watched in silence, unsure whether they were witnessing political theater or the first chapter of something far bigger. Barr slammed his palm on the table. "This is outrageous. This committee is being used as a circus for personal vendettas." Crockett didn't flinch. "Personal vendettas? No, Mr. Barr. This is about the rule of law, something you swore an oath to uphold and then betrayed for political convenience." She gestured to the binder. "These documents, these testimonies, these records, they're not my opinions. They're your actions, and the American people deserve to see them." For the first time, Barr looked cornered. The confidence had drained from his face, replaced by something far more vulnerable: fear. Narrator. What had begun as a smear attempt was now unraveling into something he could no longer control. Every page she turned was a mirror, held up to his legacy, and it did not reflect justice. "Congresswoman," the chair finally interjected, his voice measured but tense. "Do you have any further evidence to submit to the committee?" Crockett closed the binder with a decisive snap. "Yes, Mr. Chairman. This binder contains more than 100 pages of documented misconduct, sworn testimony, and financial records. And I am formally submitting all of it into the congressional record today." The room erupted again, not in laughter this time, but in disbelief, in tension, in a dawning realization that this hearing had just shifted from spectacle to scandal. Barr's voice trembled slightly now. This is an ambush. None of this will hold up. You're grandstanding for headlines." Crockett turned to face him fully, her expression resolute. "Headlines fade. Accountability doesn't. And whether it's tomorrow, next month, or next year, the truth always finds its way out." The audience was silent once more. Barr stared down at the table, hands clasped tightly together, the smirk long gone. Narrator. For the first time in his storied, controversial career, William Barr looked like a man out of moves. The fixer had no fix, the enforcer had no defense, and the story he'd controlled for decades was slipping from his grasp. Crockett took her seat again, calm as ever. But the damage was done. The cameras had captured everything. The documents, the contradictions, the anchor line that was already trending online. And somewhere, deep inside the corridors of power, alarms were going off, because this wasn't just about one hearing. It wasn't just about one congresswoman and one former attorney general. It was about something far larger, a reckoning decades in the making. And as Jasmine Crockett sat back and folded her hands, the world watching in stunned silence, one thing was clear. The aftershocks of that moment were only just beginning. The hearing ended hours ago, but its echoes refused to die. By nightfall, the digital world was ablaze. Hashtags like Narn Bar Exposed, Crockett Receipts, and Truth Over Power trended at the top of Twitter, spilling into Instagram Reels, TikTok stitches, and cable news chyrons. Millions replayed the moment Jasmine Crockett uttered those 8 searing words. Truth isn't partisan. Power isn't justice. Like a rallying cry for a country exhausted by spin. Clips of Barr's stunned silence looped across screens from coast to coast. One viral tweet captured the mood. Bill Barr spent decades bending justice to power. Today, power bent back. Another, shared over 500,000 times, read simply, Congresswoman Crockett brought receipts. And the fixer just got fixed. Newsrooms scrambled to keep up. The Washington Post led with, Barr cornered by evidence and explosive hearing. Fox News, in contrast, ran with Crockett's political circus, grandstanding or genuine oversight. MSNBC called it the reckoning of a kingmaker. Across the political spectrum, one fact was inescapable. The confrontation had detonated far beyond the committee room. Cable panels argued deep into the night. Some conservatives clung to familiar lines, that Crockett was overreaching, that the documents were misinterpreted. But even within those ranks, cracks appeared. One prominent Republican senator, speaking anonymously to reporters, admitted, "It's hard to defend what we saw today." Barr looked exposed. Other GOP figures, sensing a political storm, quietly unfollowed Barr on social media or scrubbed past photos from their pages. It was the political equivalent of rats leaving a sinking ship. Subtle but unmistakable. Progressives, meanwhile, were electrified. Lawmakers like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ayanna Pressley praised Crockett's courage. "This isn't just oversight," Pressley tweeted. "This is accountability, the kind that's been missing for far too long." Activist groups seized the momentum, launching petitions calling for formal investigations into Barr's actions as Attorney General. One petition amassed over 1 million signatures within 24 hours. Even establishment voices began to shift. A New York Times editorial board piece, titled "The Credibility Crisis at Justice," questioned whether Barr's conduct had irreparably damaged public trust in the DOJ. "If the evidence Congresswoman Crockett presented holds up," it read, "then the department must confront an uncomfortable truth. Its top official may have twisted justice to serve power." And then there was Crockett herself. Overnight, her social media following exploded. Her Instagram added 300,000 new followers in a single day. On TikTok, Gen Z creators stitched her line, "Smears fade. Evidence doesn't," into thousands of videos, setting it to triumphant music and turning it into a meme, a slogan, a movement. Talk shows invited her on. The Late Show host opened his monologue with a joke. Bill Barr called Jasmine Crockett a liar, and she called the Library of Congress. Laughter roared. But the punchline underlined a deeper truth. Crockett wasn't just a freshman congresswoman anymore. She had become something rarer, a symbol. Commentators began referring to her as the conscience of Congress. Editorials described her as the embodiment of a new political generation. Fearless, unbought, unbowed. "She speaks for those told to stay quiet," one op-ed read. "For those who've watched the powerful bend the law and walk away. And she does it armed not with slogans, but with facts." But it wasn't just admiration fueling the storm. It was unease, because Crockett's evidence, once a binder in a committee room, was now a public document. Journalists pored over every page, connecting threads and digging deeper. Headlines multiplied. Memo reveals political pressure on DOJ decisions. Whistleblower testimony points to Barr intervention. Financial ties raise questions of corruption, and with each revelation, the calls grew louder. Subpoenas, hearings, even criminal referrals. What had begun as a political clash was metastasizing into something much larger, a legal and cultural reckoning. Not everyone celebrated, of course. Barr appeared on a friendly talk show 2 days later, dismissing the entire hearing as political theater. "It's the silly season," he scoffed. These so-called documents prove nothing, but his tone lacked the swagger of old. His eyes darted nervously, and the interviewer, usually deferential, pressed harder than expected. If there's nothing to hide, why not welcome an investigation? Barr stumbled, mumbled something about partisan witch hunts, and the clip went viral. Even his allies admitted privately. He looked shaken. Meanwhile, Crockett's office was flooded with letters, emails, and voicemails, not just from her district, but from every corner of the country. Immigrant families thanked her for speaking truth to power. Civil rights veterans called her the heir to a long tradition of justice fighters. A retired DOJ attorney wrote, "I served for 30 years. I never thought I'd see someone hold the Attorney General accountable. Today I did, narrator. This was more than a takedown. It was a shift, subtle yet seismic, in the balance between power and accountability. The old playbook, the one men like Barr had relied on for decades, suddenly seemed outdated. Facts, not fear, were now driving the narrative, and the people were watching. Yet even amid the celebration, one truth loomed larger than the rest. This story was not over. The binder Crockett submitted was only the beginning. Investigations would follow, hearings would multiply, and the question of how deeply corruption had burrowed into the halls of justice was only starting to be asked. Narrator. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just ended a career. She had redrawn the lines of accountability in America. And on the other side of those lines, nothing, not even the most powerful names in Washington, would ever look the same again. The dust from the hearing had barely settled when Jasmine Crockett stepped out onto the Capitol steps, the evening sun slicing through the clouds like a spotlight. Cameras still whirred, microphones still hovered, but for a brief moment, the noise seemed to fall away. She looked out over the crowd, reporters, supporters, critics, all waiting for her next move, and spoke not like a politician chasing headlines, but like a woman carrying generations of struggle on her shoulders. "Democracy," she said quietly, her voice steady but fierce, "dies not just in darkness, but in silence. And I refuse to stay silent." The words rippled through the air, carried far beyond the marble steps, because this moment, this clash, had never really been about Bill Barr or Jasmine Crockett. It was about something deeper, older, and far more enduring. The eternal struggle between truth and power. For as long as America has existed, power has feared one thing above all: exposure. It hides behind legal jargon, cloaks itself in patriotism, and wraps its motives in the language of order and tradition. But exposure strips it bare. And that is what Crockett had done. She hadn't just shown documents. She had shown the machinery of power itself, how it protects itself, how it gaslights critics, how it counts on the public's exhaustion to escape accountability. "Lies," she told a reporter that evening, "don't fall because we wish them to. They fall because we drag the truth into the light and refuse to let go." And that, more than anything, was the lesson this confrontation burned into the national conscience. Justice isn't a gift handed down from the powerful. It's not a speech or a slogan. It's a fight, relentless, exhausting, often thankless, waged by those who dare to speak even when their voices shake. Crockett understood that fight intimately. Every courtroom she'd entered as a civil rights attorney, every hearing where she'd been dismissed as too loud or too ambitious, every sneer from those who underestimated her, all of it had led here. And now, standing in the shadow of the Capitol, she wasn't just thinking about Barr. She was thinking about every whistleblower silenced into anonymity, every community told their pain wasn't political, every immigrant, every activist, every ordinary citizen who'd ever been made to feel that truth was too small a weapon to challenge power. "This is bigger than me," she said, almost as if to herself. "Bigger than him. It's about who we become as a country when truth costs something, and whether we're still brave enough to pay the price." Narrator. Because that is the real test of a democracy. Not how it behaves when the truth is convenient, but how it behaves when the truth is dangerous. And in that sense, Crockett's stand was more than a moment. It was a mirror. It forced America to look at itself and ask hard questions. Who gets to decide what justice looks like? Who benefits when silence wins? And what happens when those who swore to defend the law use it instead as a shield for themselves? The answers were uncomfortable, but they were necessary, because this wasn't just Barr versus Crockett. This was the justice system versus the people it serves. This was a test of whether institutions built to protect liberty could survive when their own corruption was dragged into daylight. Power fears exposure. Lies crumble before evidence. And truth, fragile, stubborn, often ignored, is still the most potent weapon in a republic's arsenal. That was the moral Crockett left hanging in the air as she walked away from the microphones. Not a victory lap, not a self-congratulatory speech, just a conviction, sharp and unyielding, that the fight wasn't over, and never would be. Every time we speak, she told a young law student who stopped her on the steps, we chip away at the walls built to keep us quiet, and one day those walls fall. They always fall. Narrator. And that, in the end, was the heartbeat of the moment, a reminder that democracy doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to those who refuse to surrender it. It belongs to those who believe that truth, no matter how battered or buried, still matters. And in this America, the one Jasmine Crockett is still fighting to build, truth still has the final say. Bill Barr walked into that hearing certain of one thing, that calling Jasmine Crockett a liar would silence her. Instead, it did the opposite. It unleashed her. With evidence, with precision, with unshakable resolve, she dismantled his narrative piece by piece until the man who once defined law and order was left grasping for excuses. And in that moment, a career built on power and impunity began to crumble under the weight of truth. This story was never just about one hearing. It was about something far bigger, about who gets to define justice in America, about whether truth still matters in a time when lies are louder, and about the power of one relentless voice to shake the foundations of power itself. And here's the part that matters most, that power doesn't just belong to Jasmine Crockett. It belongs to all of us, to every person who refuses to stay silent, to every viewer who believes that no one, not even the most powerful, is beyond accountability. If that's you, you're in the right place. Because here at Liberty League, we don't just tell stories. We expose hypocrisy. We celebrate courage. We remind the powerful that they answer to the people, not the other way around. So if you believe truth still matters, if you believe democracy still belongs to the bold, then hit subscribe and join us for more jaw-dropping political drama, explosive showdowns, and stories where justice doesn't whisper, it roars. This is Liberty League, and here, the truth always gets the last word.